Want to start by saying that I almost didn't file this story. Not because it wasn't real. Not because I didn't witness it with my own two eyes, standing close enough to feel the heat of the plasma discharge on my left cheek. I didn't file it at first because I didn't know how to explain it. Because the words I kept writing felt too small for what actually happened on Station Verath 9 on the 43rd day of the 3rd galactic cycle. Some things happen in this universe that don't fit neatly into language. This is one of them. But I'm going to try anyway. Let me start where stories like this one always start. Not at the explosion, not at the moment when a man collapsed to his knees bleeding from 3 separate entry wounds and still refused to put the child down, but before all of that. When the station still smelled like recycled oxygen and vendor spice, and the particular kind of hope that only exists in transit terminals. Verath 9 isn't a glamorous station. If you've been there, you already know that. It's what the logistics crews call a connector node, one of those sprawling, half-finished orbital platforms that was originally built for cargo transfer in Sector 7, but got expanded about 11 times over 3 decades until it became this enormous, chaotic, incredibly alive thing. 94 species represented in its residential zones, 46 different currency exchanges operating simultaneously, a food court that somehow manages to cater to beings who breathe methane sitting 20 meters from beings who breathe pure nitrogen, separated by membrane barriers so thin you could put a finger through them if you tried. I'd been stationed at Verath 9 for 2 months by the time any of this happened, covering trade negotiations mostly. Tariff disputes between the Hevari Consortium and the Midrim shipping guilds. Thrilling stuff, I'm sure. The kind of reporting that makes your mother proud and your readers fall asleep. The morning it started, I was sitting in the Eastern Press Bay on level 14, nursing something that the vending unit claimed was coffee, but tasted more like hot dissolved ambition, and trying to figure out how to write a 3,000-word piece about docking fee legislation without actively boring myself to death. That's when I heard the first thing. Not an alarm, not yet. Just voices. A shift in the ambient noise of the station, the way a crowd changes register when something happens that doesn't fit into the expected shape of the day. I noticed it the way you notice weather changing, not consciously, just a kind of prickling awareness at the back of the neck. I set down my cup, I listened. The man's name was Tobias Morrow. I didn't know that yet that morning. I learned it later from records, from the statements filed by the Terran Liaison Office, from conversations I had with him directly during the weeks that followed. But at that point on that morning, he was just a shape I could see through the press bay window. A tall, broad-shouldered human male in civilian contractor clothes, standing in the main transit hub on level 14 with a child in his arms. The child was not human. She was Velthara. You know the species, bioluminescent markings along the jaw and the backs of the hands, secondary eyelids that give them that particular liquid look, slightly longer limbs in proportion to the body, a delicate crest of bone-like protrusions along the crown of the skull. Elegant creatures by any standard. The Velthara home system sits about 40 light-years rimward of Terran space, and relations between the two species are what the diplomatic corps generously call developing, which basically means they're not shooting at each other, but nobody's throwing parties either. The girl couldn't have been older than 5 or 6 cycles in Velthara terms, which made her, by human developmental comparison, somewhere around 8 years old enough to understand fear, young enough to still show it completely, no learned composure, no social mask, just absolute wordless terror in her luminescent eyes. She was holding onto Tobias Morrow's neck like he was the last solid thing in the universe. And the men surrounding them had weapons drawn. I need to explain who those men were, because this is where it gets complicated, and I want to be precise about it. They were Kethavar. If you're not familiar, and a lot of people aren't, because the Kethavar have done a very deliberate job of keeping themselves off the standard galactic news cycle, they are a humanoid-adjacent species from the outer terminus. Not widely traveled, generally. Very clan-structured. Very proud. Very particular about questions of honor and obligation, which in their social framework are basically interchangeable with questions of property and debt. The 3 Kethavar in the transit hub that morning were wearing the insignia of House Vrethak. And the child they were surrounding, the small Velthara girl clinging to Tobias Morrow's neck, had, according to what I pieced together later, been separated from her escort approximately 40 minutes earlier, when a routine maintenance alert had created a crowd surge on level 12 and scattered a diplomatic party traveling under the protection of the Velthara royal house. The Kethavar had found her first, and they had apparently decided, in that particular brand of logic that makes complete sense if you've spent your whole life in a culture where unattended valuable things are simply things that now belong to you, that the girl was now under their custody. Tobias Morrow had apparently decided otherwise. I got out of the press bay the moment I realized what I was looking at. It's a professional reflex. You see something real, you move toward it. You don't stand behind glass and watch it through a window. I had my recorder out before I hit the corridor, and I came around the corner into the transit hub with about 30 other people who had also registered that something was happening. The scene was already fully formed by the time I could see it clearly. 3 Kethavar warriors, and I use that word deliberately, because these were not bureaucrats or travelers or merchants. These were trained physical specimens in tactical coverings, and they moved like they'd spent significant time in situations requiring the application of force. They had pulse weapons drawn and angled at a middle height, which is the Kethavar way of signaling serious intent without immediate lethal aggression. A warning configuration. Give us what we want or this escalates. Tobias Morrow was standing about 4 meters from the nearest of them. He was not a small man. Human male, I'd estimate mid-30s in Terran years, broad through the shoulders and chest, with the kind of physical presence that comes from actual labor rather than recreational fitness. He was wearing contractor-grade work clothes, heavy-weave trousers, a reinforced jacket of the type favored by people who work in environments where things fall on them, and he was holding the Velthara child against his left shoulder with both arms, her face turned into his neck, one of his large hands cupped around the back of her crested head. His expression was not afraid. I want to be clear about that because I've reported on conflict situations for 19 years, and I know what fear looks like on a face, even when a person is trying very hard to hide it. Tobias Morrow's face was not hiding fear. There was no fear to hide. What was there instead was something I can only describe as a kind of flat, completely settled certainty. The expression of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at the only answer that matters and is now simply waiting for the math to resolve itself. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said. Not loudly, not theatrically, just stated it, like it was a fact about physics rather than a declaration of intent. The lead Kethavar, taller than the other 2, with facial markings that indicated ranking status within the house structure, took a step forward. "The child is under protection of House Vrethak," he said. His translator implant gave his words a slight metallic resonance. "You are interfering in a matter of honor debt. Release her and stand aside, mammal." Mammal, I noted that word. It's not technically an insult. All it means is that they'd bothered to look up the basic biological classification. But the way he said it carried about 9 layers of subtext, all of them pointing toward lesser, temporary, irrelevant. Tobias Morrow looked at the Kethavar for a long moment. Then he shifted his grip on the girl very slightly, not to put her down, but to get his footing better, to redistribute her weight against his chest in a way that freed up more of his core, and he said, very quietly, "No. What happened in the next 90 seconds is something I've replayed in my head more times than I can count." The lead Kethavar signaled his companions with a slight tilt of the head, the kind of signal that comes from years of coordination, muscle memory, practiced violence, and the 2 flanking warriors began to move, separating their angles to approach Tobias Morrow from the left and right simultaneously. Standard encirclement, classic suppression geometry. Pin the target between 3 approach vectors and give them no clean direction to move. What it didn't account for was that Tobias Morrow didn't try to move. He just turned his body smoothly so that the girl was behind him and his back was against the nearest structural pillar. He'd chosen that spot deliberately, I realized. He'd been standing there specifically because it was a wall at his back, which eliminated one of the 3 attack vectors before the move even started. The left-flanking Kethavar reached him first. I'm going to describe what happened as accurately as I can because I think it matters to get this right. The Kethavar warrior moved to grab his arm, the intent being clearly to wrench him off balance and force him to release the child, and Tobias Morrow did something I did not see coming. He didn't block it. He accepted the grip. Let the warrior's hand close on his forearm, and then used that contact point as a fixed anchor and pivoted his full body weight behind it in a way that turned the Kethavar's forward momentum against itself. The warrior stumbled. Not fell, these were trained fighters. They didn't just fall, but stumbled, lost the geometric advantage, ended up at a wrong angle. The second flanker came in during that same window. And that's when the pulse weapon fired. Not at Tobias Morrow. The lead Kethavar had aimed it at a point just to Morrow's right, a warning shot, a pressure application, the kind of discharge designed to make someone flinch and open up their defensive posture. The shot hit the wall of the pillar Morrow was standing against and scattered. A plasma scatter at close range is not immediately lethal, but it's not nothing either. Several fragments of dispersed energy hit Tobias Morrow along his right side, shoulder, ribs, the side of his neck. I heard him make a sound. Short and involuntary and immediately suppressed. The kind of sound a person makes when their body responds to pain before their mind can get control of the response. He didn't let go of the girl. He folded slightly, just slightly over the child, curled around her actually like a physical shell, his body absorbing and blocking any potential secondary scatter, and stayed there for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. His right arm was hanging wrong. The scatter had done something to the shoulder, but his left arm was still holding the girl, still cupped around her head, still keeping her face turned away from what was happening. The crowd around the hub had gone absolutely, completely still. 40 or 50 beings from at least a dozen species, all frozen. Not fleeing, frozen. The way a crowd goes when something happens that is so far outside the expected frame of normal that the ordinary response systems don't engage. I had my recorder on. I was filming. I want to say that I stepped forward, but the honest truth is that for approximately 4 seconds after that scatter hit, I was just still, like everyone else. Tobias Morrow straightened. Slowly, with what I could see, even from where I was standing, was an enormous amount of deliberate effort. He straightened, and he adjusted his hold on the girl, and he looked at the 3 Kethavar with that same expression he'd been wearing the whole time, flat, settled, certain, and he said, "That's still a no." The station security arrived at the 3-minute mark. Verath 9 security is a mixed unit, a combination of station-employed peacekeepers and representatives from the major species' diplomatic missions. They came in from 2 of the 4 corridor entrances, about 16 officers total, and the lead officer was a Hevan, large, blue-scaled, with the slow, deliberate movements of a species that processes situations carefully before acting. She saw Tobias Morrow immediately. She saw the child. She saw the scatter damage on Morrow's right side and the way he was standing. And she did something that I think speaks to the quality of that particular officer. She didn't start with the Kethavar. She walked toward Tobias Morrow first. "Sir," she said, "are you able to give the child to one of my officers?" Tobias Morrow looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the small Velthara girl, who had her face pressed against his neck, and her hands knotted in his jacket collar with the specific grip of a child who has decided that this particular anchor point is the only safe thing in the world. "Not yet," he said. "She doesn't want to go, ask her." The Heaven officer crouched down to the child's level and spoke in what I recognized as a formal Velthara greeting register. She'd done her training properly, whoever she was. She spoke for about 30 seconds, very gently, and the girl slowly turned her head and looked at the officer. Then the girl looked at Tobias Morrow. He said something to her too low for me to catch. She considered this for a long moment with the profound gravity that children apply to important decisions. Then, slowly, she reached out her arms toward the officer. Tobias Morrow transferred her over. And then, approximately 4 seconds after the child was safely out of his arms, his knees hit the deck. The medical team was already on their way. The station health protocol triggers automatically when a weapon discharge is registered in public spaces. They reached him in under 2 minutes. I was close enough by then to see the damage more clearly, and it was more than I'd realized from a distance. Plasma scatter at close range, when it catches you across the ribcage and shoulder, does something very specific to the tissue. The right side of his jacket was burned through in 3 places. The shoulder wound was the worst of it. The joint had taken direct impact, and the arm was, I would learn later, essentially non-functional at that point, the tendons and surrounding tissue severely compromised. There was also damage to his neck and the side of his face, not as severe but significant, and the impact to the ribs had cracked two of them. He was conscious. That was the thing that struck me. Even as the medics were cutting away the jacket and running their instruments over him, he was conscious and coherent, and trying to look past them to see the girl. "She's with security," I told him because I was right there and it seemed like the useful thing to say. "She's okay, they've got her." He looked at me. First time his eyes had registered my presence specifically. He had very dark eyes, this human. The kind that look like they've seen enough things that nothing quite surprises them anymore. "Good," he said. Not thank you, not that's a relief, just good, like a task had been confirmed complete. Then he lay down on the deck and let the medics work on him. The Kethavar were detained by station security, pending diplomatic review. This is standard procedure in weapon discharge incidents involving multiple parties, and I'm not going to walk through the entire administrative process, because it's long and dry, and honestly less important to this story than what was happening in the medical bay while that process was underway. I stayed in the transit hub for the first hour, getting footage and statements. Then I followed the information trail, which led me to the security office on level 12, where the Velthara diplomatic party had been reassembled after the crowd surge incident, and where, at approximately 2 hours after the initial incident, something happened that I had not anticipated at all. The Queen arrived. I should explain what I mean by that, because the Queen arrived sounds dramatic and perhaps slightly unbelievable in the context of a mid-sized orbital transit station in Sector 7, and I want you to understand how thoroughly, completely real it was. The Velthara royal house had been traveling in something they call reduced convoy, smaller escort, than normal civilian documentation rather than full diplomatic flagging, the kind of transit profile that powerful people use when they want to move without making a spectacle of themselves. The girl, whose name, I would learn, was Vea, was the Queen's daughter. Third and youngest child of Sovereign Valera Ithzone, matriarch of the Velthara royal house, ruler of a system that contained approximately 11 billion people. The Queen had been 2 levels below when her daughter went missing. I cannot imagine, and I've tried many times, what those 40 minutes between the crowd surge and the security notification were like for her. The Velthara are not a species that shows emotion in the way humans do. Their faces have different expressive architecture. But I've spoken to enough Velthara over the years to know that the secondary eyelid response is essentially involuntary. It's the equivalent of tears. You can't fake it, and you can't stop it when it happens. Sovereign Valera Ithzone came through the security-level corridor with 8 personal guards, and her secondary eyelids extended. When the door to the security office opened, and the girl looked up and saw her mother, she made a sound that I don't have the proper vocabulary for. A specific kind of cry that exists in every language and no language simultaneously. The sound of a child who has been holding together by pure determination, finally being permitted to fall apart. The Queen crossed the room in 4 strides and gathered her daughter up, and for a long moment she just stood there holding her, and the room was very quiet. Then she looked up. She looked at the security officer. She looked at the station administrator who had arrived to manage the diplomatic dimensions. She looked at the Velthara senior escort who was standing in the corner, clearly managing a significant amount of internal anguish. And she said, in a voice that was very controlled and very deliberate, "Who brought my daughter here?" The security officer told her. I watched the Queen's face while she listened. Then she said, "Take me to him." The medical bay on level 11 was not a large facility. Verath 9 isn't a medical station, just a transit node with basic care provisions, and Tobias Morrow was its most serious occupant at that moment. He'd been stabilized, which means the plasma damage had been treated to the point where nothing was going to kill him immediately. But he was in one of those medical gray states where everything hurts, and you're running on whatever chemical composure the pain management protocols allow. He was awake when I got there, which surprised me. I'd arrived a few minutes before the Queen's party because I'd moved fast through a service corridor and gotten there ahead of the main route. He was lying on the medical pallet, right arm immobilized in a regeneration sleeve, various monitoring devices doing their quiet work around him. And he was staring at the ceiling with the particular expression of someone who is choosing, very deliberately, to be okay with what is currently happening to their body. I stood at the edge of the bay. He heard me and turned his head. "You're the reporter," he said. "Yes, Oren Dast, United Press. Are you willing to talk?" He considered this. Later maybe, today was a lot. "Fair enough," I said. "I just wanted you to know the girl, Vea, her mother is coming." Something moved in his expression. Not a big thing, just a slight shift around the eyes, a micro-relaxation in the set of his mouth. "Good," he said again. Still just that one word, but this time it carried more weight. "Can I ask you one thing? Just one thing for right now." He looked at me for a moment. "Go ahead." "Why didn't you put her down when the shot hit? Why didn't you just put her down and step back?" Tobias Morrow looked at the ceiling again for a moment. "Because she was holding on," he said. "You don't put down a kid who's holding on." That was the sentence I was sitting with when the door opened, and Sovereign Valera Ithzone walked into the medical bay. She came in ahead of her guards. I think she outpaced them deliberately. The movement was purposeful, direct, the walk of someone who has decided to be somewhere and is not interested in the logistical considerations of everyone else. She stopped at the threshold of Tobias Morrow's bay, and she looked at him. He turned his head and looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The queen was tall, Velthara 10 toward height, and she was above average even for her species. The bioluminescent markings along her jaw and hands were more pronounced than most, a genetic marker of the royal bloodline, and they were doing something I hadn't seen in Velthara markings before, pulsing, slightly, in a slow, rhythmic way. I'd learn later that this is an involuntary physiological response associated with extreme emotional states, the Velthara equivalent of a shaking voice. She looked at the regeneration sleeve on his arm, at the burn treatment on his neck, at the monitoring array beeping quietly around him. "You are in pain," she said, not a question. "Less than a few hours ago," Tobias Morrow said. His tone was the same it had been throughout, direct, unembellished, perfectly level. Like a man who was constitutionally incapable of performing the expected social behaviors around royalty because he'd never really gotten around to learning what those were. "My daughter," the queen began, then stopped, took a breath, started again. "Vea told me what you did." "I didn't do that much," he said. Sovereign Valera Ithzone looked at him for a very long moment. "You held my daughter while armed warriors tried to take her from you," she said. "You took a weapons discharge rather than release her." "She was holding on," he said. "I already explained this to the reporter." I don't think Tobias Morrow had any idea who he was talking to, or rather, I think he knew in the abstract sense that this was someone important, but the concept of conducting himself differently in front of someone important appeared to be genuinely foreign to him. He wasn't being disrespectful. He was just incapable of the social performance. A man who had exactly one mode, direct. The queen looked at him for another long moment. Then she did something I did not expect at all. She sat down on the medical stool beside his pallet. Not the Velthara formal greeting posture, not the sovereign address position. She just sat down like a person who is tired and has found a chair. "What is your name?" she asked. "Tobias Morrow." "You are contracted to this station." "Survey crew, structural assessment for the level 19 expansion." "You have family." A brief pause, back in Terran space, sister, her kids. "And you are here, on this station, far from them." "Work takes you places," he said, simple as that. The queen was quiet for a moment. The monitoring devices beeped. The regeneration sleeve hummed its low electrical hum. Outside, somewhere in the corridor, I could hear the quiet movement of her guard contingent. "Tobias Morrow," the queen said, and there was something in the way she said the name, a particular care and weight, the way you speak something that you are trying to memorize. "I am in your debt." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You are incorrect," she said. "But I understand why you believe that. Your species does not always recognize the weight of what it does." She paused. "I would like to speak with you again when you are less," she glanced at the medical equipment, "occupied." "I'm probably going to be here a few days," Tobias Morrow said. "Then I will stay a few days," said Sovereign Valera Ithzone, matriarch of the royal house, ruler of 11 billion people. Tobias Morrow looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but my daughter is sleeping in the next room and you saved her, and I find that I am not ready to be somewhere else just yet." That night, sitting in the press bay and trying to organize my notes, I kept coming back to something. Not the action, not the plasma scatter or the pulse weapons or the way Tobias Morrow had stood with a broken shoulder and cracked ribs and refused to let go. Those were remarkable, and I would write about them, and they deserved to be written about. What I kept coming back to was that word. Good. He'd said it twice, both times when he'd confirmed the girl was safe. Not thank God or that's a relief or anything that centered himself in the equation at all. Just good. The satisfied acknowledgement of a task completed, a small piece of the world made temporarily better. I've covered wars. I've covered famine responses and diplomatic crises and species, contact events and corporate extraction operations that would make your hair stand up. I have seen humans at their worst, which is genuinely terrible, and I have seen them at their best, which is something that other species consistently underestimate. We underestimated ourselves, I think. We're so accustomed to the worst of us that the best of us surprises us every time. Tobias Morrow had done what he did because a child was holding on, because she needed someone to hold on to, because in the entire transit hub full of beings from a dozen species, he was the one who happened to be there and happened to have arms and happened to be the kind of person for whom that was sufficient. That was the whole calculation, not heroism, not ideology, not even conscious choice, really. Just the simple, irreducible human refusal to put down something small and frightened when the alternative is walking away. I finished my notes at 300 station time and went asleep. In the morning, when I passed the medical wing on my way to the press bay, I looked through the corridor window. Sovereign Valera Ithzone was still there. She was sitting in the chair beside Tobias Morrow's bay, with a data tablet in her hand, reading. Vea was curled on a second pallet that the medical staff had arranged in the room, sleeping. And Tobias Morrow was apparently also asleep, which meant the Queen was sitting in a room with an unconscious human contractor she'd met 12 hours ago, reading, because she had said she wasn't ready to be somewhere else yet. I looked at that scene for a moment. Then I went and got my terrible coffee and sat down to write the first version of this document. End of Part 1. Filed from Verath 9 Medical Correspondent Bay, Standard Cycle 4471.4. I had planned to leave Verath 9 after 5 days. The initial story was filed. The Kethavar incident had been reviewed by the Station Diplomatic Committee. House Vrethek had issued a formal apology through their outer terminus liaison, and Tobias Morrow was well into the regeneration process that was going to return most of the function to his right shoulder over the coming weeks. The immediate crisis had resolved itself into the comfortable administrative process that follows crises when nobody dies, and there was a tariff summit on Hevan Prime that my editor wanted me to cover. I stayed for 12 weeks. I want to explain why, because it's not the kind of thing a journalist does. We move. That's the nature of the work. You follow the story to wherever the story goes, and then you follow the next story, and you do this until you're too tired or too old to keep up with the velocity of events in this particular corner of the universe. Staying in one place for 12 weeks because of a human contractor and an alien queen, and the strange gravity of what had started between them on a transit station medical bay, that's not normal field behavior. But here's the thing about this story. Here's what I figured out somewhere around week 3, when I'd already pushed my departure twice. It wasn't over. What I'd watched begin in that transit hub on level 14 was not a one-time incident that would resolve itself neatly and be filed in the archive, and referenced occasionally when people wanted examples of human stubbornness in the face of armed opposition. It was the beginning of something, and I am a correspondent who has been in this business long enough to know when the beginning of something is actually happening, and to understand that leaving before it completes is a professional failure that you'll spend years regretting. So I stayed, and this is what I saw. The first week was medical. Tobias Morrow's recovery was going to take time. The shoulder regeneration process on Station Verath 9 was working with equipment that was perfectly adequate for a transit facility, but not exactly cutting edge. And the plasma damage to his neck and the cracked ribs added complications that pushed the timeline out. He was not a patient. in either sense of the word. The medical staff on level 11 were professional and clearly experienced, but I got the impression that dealing with Tobias Morrow was a specific kind of challenge. He was not demanding. He didn't complain, didn't argue with the treatment protocols, didn't ask for anything he hadn't been specifically offered. But he kept trying to work. The survey crew he'd been contracted with, a small outfit called Keldrath Structural, 4 humans and a Hevan, came to visit on the second day, and he spent 2 hours going over assessment data on a pad with them, one-handed, while the regeneration sleeve ran its processes on his right arm. "He cannot take rest," one of the Velthara Royal Guards told me, outside in the corridor. He'd been assigned to the medical level as part of the Queen's personal security contingent, and we developed the kind of relationship that emerges between people who are spending a lot of time in the same corridor. Not friendship exactly, but the comfortable familiarity of shared observation. "He's not good at it," I agreed. "It is a species trait," the guard said, not unkindly, with something that sounded almost like admiration. "The records we have of human populations, they are always doing. Even when there is nothing to do, they find something. It's exhausting to observe from the outside." "Try being on the inside," I said. He looked at me with the liquid Velthara gaze, and I think, in his culture, that might have been the equivalent of a laugh. Sovereign Valera Ithzone had, in fact, rearranged her travel schedule. I confirmed this through the Velthara diplomatic liaison on the station, a carefully worded inquiry that got me a carefully worded response, which in diplomatic language means, "Yes, this is accurate, and we'd prefer you didn't make a large public issue of it." The Royal House's original itinerary had continued transit to Sector 9, where a series of trade meetings and cultural exchange events had been scheduled. Those events had been postponed by approximately 2 weeks. The official explanation was security review following transit incident, which was technically accurate and also happened to coincide with the Queen staying on Verath 9. I don't know exactly what she said to her advisors to make that happen. I can imagine the conversations, the careful diplomatic framing, the balancing of obligation against schedule, the quiet royal authority that ends debates. What I know is that she stayed, and that she was present in the medical wing every day, and that the time she spent there was not, from what I observed, the formal acknowledgement of debt ceremony that you might expect from a sovereign. It was something more ordinary than that. She talked to him. I'm going to be precise about this, because I think imprecision would distort it. I didn't eavesdrop on their conversations. I'm a journalist, not a spy, and the medical bay had no recording permissions beyond what the station transparency protocols required for documentation of the weapon incident. What I observed was the exterior, 2 people occupying the same room for extended periods, talking in the way 2 people talk when they're in the early stages of figuring each other out. What I noticed, Sovereign Valera Ithzone arrived each morning without her full guard complement. She left the formal escort in the corridor, always a minimum of 2 remained. She wasn't reckless, and she brought a data tablet and often food. Velthara dietary requirements are quite different from human ones, but the station's food synthesis units can accommodate the basic exchanges, and she apparently spent time figuring out what Tobias Morrow ate and finding the equivalents that worked in the medical bay's limited preparation system. Tobias Morrow accepted this without making a fuss about it, which, for him, I was beginning to understand was actually a fairly significant social act. He was not a person who accepted things easily. He took care of things. He didn't readily permit things to be done for him. The fact that he sat with this woman and ate the food she'd arranged for him and talked to her without visibly trying to redirect the situation, that meant something. On the 4th day, Vea came with her mother. The girl walked into the medical bay with the particular combination of confidence and caution that children deploy when they want to appear braver than they feel. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Tobias Morrow with the regeneration sleeve on his arm and the monitoring array around him, and then she walked across the room and stood beside the pallet and looked at him directly. "Does it hurt?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. "A little," he said. "Less every day." She considered this seriously. Then she reached out and very carefully put her hand on his left forearm, the uninjured one, with the absolute deliberateness of a child making a deliberate choice. "Mama says you kept holding even when it hurt," she said. Your mama is very well informed, he said. She talks to the security officer a lot, Vea said. She asks many questions. Said Tobias Morrow. I am not afraid anymore, the girl announced in the tone of someone issuing a formal statement. I was very afraid before, but I am not now. That's good, Tobias Morrow said. That's really good. And his voice, just on that last sentence, did something it hadn't done before in any of the exchanges I'd observed or heard about. It shifted. Warmed by a fraction, like a window cracking open in a room that's been closed for a long time. Vea apparently decided this constituted a satisfactory interaction, because she then asked if she could see the regeneration sleeve more closely. And Tobias Morrow spent the next 20 minutes explaining the basic principles of soft tissue regeneration technology to a small Velthara child with the patient, detailed thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed explaining how things worked. The queen sat in her chair and watched them, and her bioluminescent markings did the slow pulse thing again. By the end of week 1, the Kethavar situation had been formally resolved. House Vrethak's liaison had attended 2 diplomatic sessions with the station committee and the Velthara royal representatives, and the outcome was what tends to happen when a mid-tier outer rim clan structure encounters the full diplomatic weight of a sovereign royal house. A comprehensive formal apology, a significant reparations commitment, and the quiet reassignment of the 3 warriors in question to duties that would keep them considerably further from any transit stations involving Velthara nationals. The weapons discharge citation against the Kethavar was entered into the Galactic Transit Authority record. This is not a trivial thing. The GTA record follows a vessel and its operators across a very large number of station permissions and trade authorizations. House Vrethak was going to feel that entry for years. Tobias Morrow, as the injured party, was consulted on the reparations structure. He declined personal compensation 3 times before the station administrator finally explained, with some exasperation, that this was not a negotiable category in transit incident proceedings, and that he was going to receive the standard award whether he wanted it or not. He accepted it, and within 48 hours had directed the entire sum to the station Veyrath 9 Children's Medical Fund, a charity that provided treatment access for families transiting through the station without diplomatic-grade medical coverage. I only found this out because the fund administrator mentioned it to me in passing, completely unaware that I was working on a story that involved the same individual. Tobias Morrow had not mentioned it to me, had not mentioned it to anyone as far as I could determine. I filed a note about it and kept it for later. Some details you hold on to and let them accumulate weight. Week 2, Tobias Morrow started walking again. The shoulder was still in process. The regeneration timeline for joint damage of that severity is typically 3 to 4 weeks depending on the equipment available. But the rib injuries had healed to the point where mobility was permitted, and the burns on his neck and face had been fully treated. He looked walking through the level 11 corridors like someone who'd had a bad month but was mostly past it, moving a little carefully on the right side, otherwise himself. He resumed work on the survey project, coordinating with his crew from the station's contractor workspace on level 18. The Keldrath structural outfit had gotten 3 weeks behind on the level 19 assessment because of the incident, and Tobias Morrow apparently considered this to be an unacceptable state of affairs that required his personal attention to correct. What I observed during week 2 was that the Queen's visits continued and shifted in character. The medical context had given them a defined framework. She came to check on his recovery. She brought food and data materials. They talked in the contained environment of the medical bay. Once he was ambulatory, that framework dissolved. But the visits didn't stop. Instead, they evolved into something less structured and correspondingly more revealing. She came to the contractor workspace on level 18 once, which I'm told caused a considerable amount of consternation among the other 4 members of the Keldrath crew, none of whom had been informed that their colleague had apparently made friends with interstellar royalty. She sat in a chair in the corner and watched them work on structural assessment diagrams for about an hour. She didn't interrupt. She just watched, with the focused attention of someone who finds the unfamiliar genuinely interesting. Tobias Morrow didn't introduce her formally to the crew. He said simply, "This is Velara. She's from the Velthara system, and then went back to the assessment schematic he'd been reviewing. The 4 other crew members spent the next 3 hours trying to figure out if they were supposed to be behaving differently and ultimately concluded, apparently, that if their colleague wasn't treating it as a big deal, they probably shouldn't either. I find this detail, the way Tobias Morrow created space for her to just be a person, without the apparatus of her rank, worth recording. I don't know if he did it deliberately or if it was simply his natural mode of operating extended to one more person in his environment. I suspect the latter. I don't think Tobias Morrow had the social instinct for deliberate social management. He just treated people the way he treated people, which was, directly, consistently, without performance. For someone whose entire existence involved being treated as sovereign first and person second, I imagine this was unusual. The Velthara royal escort was getting restless. I don't mean the guards, they were professionals. They went where the sovereign went and said nothing about it publicly. I mean the senior diplomatic and administrative staff. The Queen had an apparatus. Advisors, secretaries, cultural liaisons, communication officers, and the entire logistical structure that travels with a head of state, even when they're trying to travel quietly. These people had also rearranged their schedules for this station. They had been managing the diplomatic fallout from the Kethavar incident, handling the postponed Sector 9 obligations, and I strongly suspect, trying to understand what was happening with their sovereign and the human contractor from the Level 14 transit hub. I had a conversation with the senior royal advisor, a formal, meticulous Velthara named Sethir Ova, who was clearly operating on about 3 levels of diplomatic caution simultaneously, in which he managed to communicate, without saying anything directly communicable, that the situation was not without complexity. The sovereign's gratitude is, he paused for a very precise interval, profound. It seems like it, I said. The human, Morrow, he is a person of significant character. He seems to be. Another precise pause. The sovereign has not, there are not many situations in which the sovereign encounters someone who does not adjust their behavior in her presence. He doesn't really adjust anything, I said. He's the same with everyone. Sethir Ova looked at me with eyes that had been managing complex situations for several decades. Yes, he said, quite. That was the extent of what he said directly. But the subtext was clear enough. The Queen's senior advisor was aware that something was happening, was uncertain about its implications, and was managing his uncertainty with the finely calibrated patience of someone who has spent a career knowing when to act and when to wait. He was waiting. The second week ended with a dinner. I wasn't there. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't invited, and the security protocols around the Queen's private engagements meant that my press credentials didn't get me access to that level of the royal house's activities. What I know about the dinner comes from Tobias Morrow, who told me about it later, with the characteristic sparseness of a man who recounts events rather than performing them. The Queen had asked him to have dinner, not in the medical wing, not in the contractor workspace, in the formal guest quarters that the royal house had taken for their extended stay, which were on Level 7, the diplomatic residence level of Verath 9. A proper dinner with a Velthara meal, with Vea present and 2 of the senior household staff. Tobias Morrow had said yes. Was it, I searched for a diplomatic way to ask what I wanted to ask. Was it strange, the setting? Little bit, he said. The table was very tall, Velthara proportions. My feet didn't really reach the floor properly. I looked at him. That's what struck you about it. It struck me about it, he confirmed. The food was good though, strange textures, but good. And the conversation. A longer pause. Tobias Morrow looked at his hands for a moment, both of them, the regeneration sleeve now removed, the shoulder functional if not fully strong yet. He started, stopped, tried again. She's carrying a lot for one person. The whole system, 11 billion people, the politics, the trade alliances, the internal house pressures, all of it on one person all the time. And she doesn't get to just be tired about it. You know, she has to be what she is all the time, every minute. He paused again. Vea talks a lot, he added. She told me the names of 47 different biological classifications she'd memorized for a school assessment. I didn't know 47 of them myself. She's clearly recovered well, I said. Yeah, he said, she really has. He said it the same way he'd said good, with that same quiet, private relief, like the most important thing, the only thing that had ever really mattered in this particular chain of events, was the small child at the tall table talking about biological classifications. 3 weeks in, the Queen's schedule reasserted itself. The Sector 9 engagements could not be pushed any further. There were treaty implications, and the Velthara Senior Trade Council was apparently getting diplomatically itchy. The royal house began the logistical preparation for departure. Tobias Morrow's recovery was on track. His shoulder was at approximately 70% function, and the Keldrath crew was back on schedule with the Level 19 assessment. The practical situation was resolving. Everything was moving toward its natural endpoint. I think everyone on the station, the diplomatic staff, the security personnel, the contractor crew, the medical team, the assorted bystanders who'd been following the story in the way that people on transit stations follow interesting things when they're between other places, expected that it would end there. A sovereign expression of formal gratitude, perhaps a gift or recognition of some kind, and a departure. The clean, satisfying conclusion of an extraordinary incident. What happened instead was that Sovereign Valera Ithzone, 2 days before her scheduled departure, asked Tobias Morrow if he would consider a contract position with the Velthara Royal House. He told me about it in the contractor workspace on Level 18. He'd come off a 6-hour assessment shift, his crew had gone to eat, and he was doing what he did at the end of long work days, sitting with a coffee that he'd actually gotten from a unit that produced something legitimately close to the real thing, which was one of the few amenities Level 18 offered, and going through the day's data with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who actually loved the work they did. I knocked on the doorframe. He waved me in. She offered me a contract, he said before I'd even sat down, which told me he'd been thinking about it all day and had given up on the idea of not telling me. I know, I said. He looked at me. How? Senior diplomatic advisor, he told me, indirectly, very diplomatically. Tobias Morrow made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. Course he did. What kind of contract? Structural assessment. The Royal House is doing a major infrastructure renovation on the third moon of their home planet, seismic reinforcement, residential expansion, some kind of cultural heritage preservation project around a few of the old city centers. They need survey crews. Apparently Keldrath's work on the Level 19 assessment got noticed, and he paused. She asked. And? He turned his coffee cup around in his hands for a moment. It's a good contract, good work, real work, not just transit platform extensions, significant project. But, another pause. I've never been to the Velthara home system, he said. Most humans haven't, I said. No, I know, I'm just, he stopped, turned the cup around again. It's a long way from Terran space. This was not, I had come to understand, a logistical concern. Tobias Morrow was a surveyor who had been on Verath 9 for 2 months. He was already a long way from Terran space. Distance from home was not a novel feature of his professional life. What he was actually saying, what I heard behind the words, was something else entirely. It's a long way to go because of what I think this also might be, and I don't know how to navigate that, and I've only ever had one mode of operation, which is direct, and I am not sure directness is the right tool for this particular situation. He didn't say any of that. He said, it's a long way from Terran space. What did you tell her? I asked. Told her I'd think about it. And are you thinking about it? He picked up his coffee and drank the last of it. Apparently I'm thinking about it all day, every day, and also telling a journalist about it so. The departure was set for standard cycle, 4471.17. I was there at the Level 7 diplomatic departure bay, in my capacity as a field correspondent who had now spent 3 weeks observing an ongoing situation and had absolutely no intention of missing its conclusion. There was a formal ceremony of some kind. The Royal House had a protocol for departures from stations where diplomatic incidents had occurred, and the station administrator was there, and the security officer who'd handled the initial incident, and several of the senior diplomatic representatives who'd been involved in the Kethavar proceedings. Tobias Morrow was there too. He stood slightly apart from the formal gathering, in the contractor clothes that appeared to be his default dress code for everything, because that was who he was. He'd brought nothing. No gift, no formal statement. He just stood there in the way he stood places, which was solidly, with both feet on the ground and no particular performance about it. The formal ceremony was brief. The Queen said the appropriate things to the station administrator. Papers were signed, actual physical papers, which the Velthara royal house apparently prefers for formal documentation, an old tradition. The security officer received a formal commendation from the house. Everything was properly managed and properly concluded. Then the Queen walked toward Tobias Morrow. She walked without her formal bearing, or rather, the formal bearing was still there because it was structural, built into the way she'd been raised to move, but it was softer at the edges, like a door slightly open rather than completely closed. She stopped in front of him. "You have thought further," she said, not a question. "Some," he said. "And—" He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the formal gathering had gone very still in the way crowds go still when they sense that something important is being decided. "The survey contract," he said. "Your people sent the details through Keldrath's channel. I looked at the scope. It's a 3-year project minimum." "Yes," she said. "The seismic assessment work on the heritage sites, that's complicated. The geological profile of your third moon is different from anything in my existing portfolio. Our survey teams are capable of briefing. I know, I read the preliminary data. I'd want to start at the bedrock surveys before we touch the heritage foundations. Work up from the bottom rather than in from the surface." A pause. "That would be the correct approach," she said carefully. "I thought so," he said. "I'd need to bring 2 of my crew. The Heaven Vess, she's done stabilization work in geologically active areas, and Caro for the precision mapping. Can't do this kind of project short-handed." The Queen looked at him for a moment. "That can be arranged," she said. "And he paused. "I'll need honest answers if I ask questions about the political situation around the heritage sites. Survey work on culturally sensitive ground gets complicated if you're working blind on the politics. I need to know the real context." "You will have honest answers," she said, and then very quietly, "I do not believe I know how to be dishonest with you. I'm not sure the format would work." Something moved in Tobias Morrow's face. Just for a moment, that fractional warmth, the window opening. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." "Okay," she said. "Okay," he confirmed. Vea ran the last 10 meters. She'd been standing with her household attendants at a respectful distance during the adult conversation, which she had apparently managed to endure for about as long as could be reasonably expected of a small child who had something she wanted to do. When the conversation reached what she apparently assessed as a natural pause point, she broke from the attendants and ran across the departure bay floor to where Tobias Morrow was standing. He caught her. "That's the exact right word for it," she launched herself, trusting completely that he would catch her. And he caught her with his left arm, the shoulder not yet at full strength but functional enough. And she went up against his chest exactly the way she had in the transit hub, face against his neck, hands knotted in his collar. "You are coming," she said, not a question, an announcement. "Coming where?" he said. "Home," she said. "Our home, you are coming." He held her for a moment. "For a while," he said, "for the project." "For a while is good," she said, with the philosophical pragmatism of a small person who has learned that you take what you can get and build from there. He set her down carefully, and she went back to the attendants at a walk this time, satisfied. Then he looked at the Queen. She was watching him. Her bioluminescent markings were doing the slow pulse again, the involuntary response, the thing she couldn't quite control. She didn't try to hide it. She just let it be there. 3 years is a long project, he said. "It is," she agreed. "Could go longer, depending on what we find in the bedrock." "That is frequently the case with such assessments." "Yeah," said Tobias Morrow, and then after a pause so short it was almost not a pause at all. "Good." They left on standard cycle 4471.17, as scheduled. I watched the Royal House convoy depart from the observation platform on level 8. The ship was elegant in the way Velthara vessels tend to be, long, curved, built with a kind of functional beauty that their engineers have been refining for centuries. It moved out of the Veyrath 9 docking ring with practiced precision and oriented itself toward the transit corridor that would take it rimward, toward Sector 9 and beyond. I stood at the observation window for a while after it was gone. Around me, the station was already doing what transit stations do, absorbing the departure, filling the space with the next wave of arrivals and transactions and small urgent dramas of 1,000 lives in motion. Veyrath 9 didn't stop or pause. It just kept being itself, enormous and chaotic and incredibly alive. 50,000 people moving through it on any given day, most of them not knowing or caring that 3 weeks ago something extraordinary had happened on level 14, and its ripples had been spreading outward ever since. I went to get my coffee. I sat in the press bay. I started writing this document. Here is what I know about Tobias Morrow, assembled from 3 weeks of observation and conversation, and the careful filling in of gaps with documented records. He was born in a mid-sized city in the northern region of the North American continent on Earth, third planet of the Sol system, to a family of builders. His father and grandfather both worked in structural construction, different materials and scales from what Tobias ended up doing, but the same fundamental orientation toward the physical world. Things need foundations. Foundations need to be true, and the truth of a foundation is something you verify yourself rather than taking on faith. He went to space at 22. Not for the romance of it, he said directly, that he has limited patience for the romance of space narrative, but because the structural assessment work that interested him required going where the structures were, and the most interesting structures were increasingly off-world. He spent the subsequent 13 years working his way through survey contracts across sectors 4, 5, and 7, building a reputation for meticulous accuracy and a particular talent for identifying structural vulnerabilities that other crews missed. He had no record of prior incidents involving weapon discharges, diplomatic situations, or alien royalty. He had a pattern across his contract history of finishing every project he started. In 13 years, he had not once abandoned a contract before its completion. The Keldrath crew chief, a woman named Sina who had worked with him for 4 years and spoke about him with the particular kind of affection that comes from professional trust built over time, told me, "Tobias doesn't leave things unfinished. That's the whole thing about him. He picks it up and he carries it until it's done." He picked it up and carried it until it was done. I thought about the girl in the transit hub holding on. I thought about the way he'd stood with a scatter-damaged shoulder and cracked ribs and not put her down. I thought about the Queen, sitting in a chair in a medical bay on a mid-sized transit station, reading, because she wasn't ready to be somewhere else yet. Some things in this universe resist being filed cleanly. They resist being resolved into the neat categories of incident and response and outcome. They stay open, alive, like a project that's going longer than expected because of what you found in the bedrock. 3 years minimum, he'd said, could go longer. I filed the initial incident report on Standard Cycle 4471.4. I'm filing this follow-up document on Standard Cycle 4471.18, 1 day after the departure. I don't know exactly what happens next. I don't know what the survey project finds in the geological layers of the Velthera third moon, or what those 3 years look like from the inside, or what the relationship between Tobias Morrow and Sovereign Velera Ithzone becomes as time accumulates around it. I'm not a prophet. I'm a correspondent. What I know is what I saw. I saw a man hold on when it would have been perfectly reasonable to let go, because the small thing he was holding on for needed him to hold on. I saw a queen recognize that and refuse, not dramatically, not politically, but simply and stubbornly, and in the specific way that powerful people refuse things when they've decided the refusal matters, to let it be over. I saw a child run 10 meters and launch herself, trusting completely and be caught. And I heard a man, a quiet, direct, unremarkable, and completely extraordinary man, agree to go somewhere very far from where he came from because the work was good and honest answers had been promised, and 3 years was a long project, and sometimes the things you hold on to are worth the distance it takes to carry them. Good, he said. Just that. Good.